issues are so complex, there's not one well, I think what is not important and they're all brainwashed, they're taken out of it. I don't even see that problem for something. Exactly. As if, yeah. But, you know, when one way of looking at it. Yeah. That I think
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming here and participating in this discussion group. My name is Armen Sarkissian. I'm former professor of physics and mathematics, former prime minister, now a free man, and I represent here the Energy Security Council, the Eurasia House in London, and also Eurasia Center at the Judge Business School in Cambridge University. And the theme that we're going to debate and discuss today is quite an exciting one. It's rethinking energy security. If you were going to do this, let's say 30 years ago, basically linking energy security supply and demand with economic growth, it could have been probably quite a simple issue because it will be two-dimensional, energy security or energy supply, and here you would have something like economic growth. Probably for economic growth, you know you need more energy and how to find it. Today, at the beginning of the 21st century, I think this issue has become specifically today much more complex because we have to think also about climate change. So we have to handle economic growth, energy security, and also to handle climate change. But the issue is not only three-dimensional, it's also probably four or fifth or six or seven because the fourth will be food, the fifth will be water, and everything is around energy because energy in many cases is the cause of damage to climate. But it can be also the source of the solution. So we are here to think how we are going to live further. And the issue is here to find an optimized way of living, basically addressing energy security, addressing economic growth, damaging less and less the climate, and also resolving issues like the food and water and etc. So it's about harmonization and optimization rather than just a single linear growth. So it's a complex thing, and the question is, what do you think? What do we think about that today? What do we think about the link between economic growth, energy security, and climate, and further? And are there any aspects of solution that are missing? Because in order to resolve this issue, we need a basis for that. We need a basis of discussion. We need a basis of exchange, of interaction, cooperation, coordination, maybe even governance. So these are my main questions that I'm going to address first to our very impressive panel and then to the audience as well. And let me start with our panel, and it starts with Mr. Fatih Birol, who is the chief economist of International Energy Agency. And then next is Mr. Robert Hormats, who is the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Economic, Energy, and Agricultural Affairs. Exactly the right person to answer the question. Third is Mr. Lars Josefsson, who represents business and is the president and the CEO of the Vattenfall from Sweden. And then we have Mr. Jim Leape, who is the Director General of WWF, represents the interests of all of us here and those who are outside nature. And then I have my good friend from Judge Business School. He was my guest at Judge Business School, Mr. Anand Sharma, who is the Minister of Commerce and Energy of India. And I will start with Fatih Birol.
Commerce and Industry.
Commerce and Industry, I'm sorry. So I would like to start with Mr. Fatih Birol, then go to our politicians representing one, the West, big United States, and rising power India. And then I'll go to business, and then we'll see what's up. So, Fatih, may I ask everybody 3-4 minutes initial remarks, and I just remind everybody that this session is on the record. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you, Armen. Now, as Armen said, the energy security and climate change are the twin challenges of our time, and there are many interlinkages between those two. Sometimes when you take a decision to address the climate change, it does help to address the energy security and vice versa. But there are some exceptions too. And as Armen said, it's a very complex issue. So I would like to focus on one issue only here, which I think is crucial. It is oil. Now, first of all, on the climate change side, when we talk about climate change, we automatically go to coal and then go to the other fuels. But let me remind you that today oil is responsible about 40% of the CO2 emissions, which is almost the same for coal. Second, after this, let me come to the security side. When we look at the oil supply situation in the next few decades, the picture doesn't look very comfortable. From a point of view of the geology, especially in non-OPEC areas, the declining production, increasing decline rates. Second, from the investment framework, that there are less and less areas that the investment can be done in a free form, and getting oil out of the under the ground will be more and more complex. And it is not an exaggeration to say that oil and geopolitics will be more and more interwoven in the next years to come. So on the basis of these facts, I think we have all the reasons to expect that we will see higher prices and volatile prices with the current policies in place. And higher volatile prices mean, I would say, bad news for the global economy. So what can we do? I think the solution, at least one of the solutions, or one of the key solutions, is on the demand side. We have to slow down the oil demand growth. And where it is the mobility sector, the transportation sector. Today, worldwide, we consume about 86 million barrels per day. And with the current policies in place, this will increase substantially, mainly coming from China, India, and other developing regions. And this is mainly driven by the car ownership levels, and the others. If we want to slow down the oil demand growth, we have to look at A, using alternative fuels, such as biofuels, and B, and perhaps more importantly, to look at the advanced car technologies, namely electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. This would, looking at the demand side responses, this would slow down the oil demand growth, and it will make the oil markets less tense, more comfortable, and perhaps avoid higher prices to come in the next 10, 15, 20 years. Because with the current policies in place, we are pushing the limits of conventional oil, and all the burden of increasing the oil production will be on the shoulders of very few number of countries in the world, which may be risky. So, what perhaps just to finish my 4 minutes, what we have done in the IEA is we looked if the world energy system would respond to the call of the world leaders, namely bring the global temperature or limit the global temperature increase about 2 degrees Celsius, what needs to be done in the energy sector? What kind of transformation we need? And one of the implications is, again, on the mobility sector, and just to make it very simple, in order to come with such a trajectory, in 2030, every second car sold need to be from advanced car technology, electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. And such a trajectory would limit the world oil demand in 2030 around 90 million barrels per day, which is perfectly in line with our resources and reserves we have. It wouldn't put too much pressure on the producing countries. It wouldn't lead to higher price environments, and the price levels that we are going to see may be good for the global economy, both for producers and consumers. So my suggestion is, Armen, to sum up, in order to ease the tensions on the oil supply security in the next years to come, a key option would be to look at the mobility sector and have, if I may say so, a revolution there to go for low-carbon technologies. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Fatih. I think it's a good start because at the end of the day, you show some light at the end of the dark tunnel. So we start with optimistic note. I would like to go now to Robert Hormats and ask him about you are representing the biggest economy in many aspects. And of course, Fatih spoke about only a specific part of it, which is the transportation and oil. Could you please make your presentation around the United States, but also a bit wider, please, not only transportation, please.
Sure. Thank you very much. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Let me make a few broad points and then focus in on one particular. One, from our point of view, if you look at energy security in the current environment, it is really a function of the diversity of suppliers, of types of fuel, and of modes or vehicles of transportation. If you look at diversity as a critical element in energy security, putting it in that sort of framework, I think, gives one an understanding of the kinds of issues one has to look at. The more variety of the kinds of fuels available, greater diversification of suppliers of fuel, and various modes of transportation. All of them, to the extent there is diversification, there's also a greater chance of security. The second point relates to natural gas, which is a very interesting new development, perhaps the most dramatic new development on the energy scene over the last several years. We've seen in the United States really a transformation in the natural gas area as a result of the fracking, and which is the way of getting natural gas out of shale, including shale that was not available, or gas that was not available in shale for a great many years, and also horizontal drilling. When you add the two together, these technologies have produced a surge in the capability of North America to produce natural gas, and they are also applicable to many other countries. And we're seeing that around the world as these new technologies become adopted, because other countries also have shale, unconventional shale. The United States has pioneered this, but there are many other parts of the world that can use similar technologies. China is one, India is another, but there are many others outside of North America, and Western Europe as well. That's a second point. So that's something that is both transformational at the moment, and natural gas, additional natural gas, can serve as a bridge fuel from a high carbon, high emission world to a world where we depend more and more on renewables. But this natural gas surge can be a bridge from one to the other. Another interesting element that I think is important, and doesn't get as much notice, or at least not as much in North America, is the new finds that have taken place in other countries that are not traditional exporters of energy. Papua New Guinea is one example. Uganda, Ghana, Vietnam, Cambodia, a number of other countries are going to be, over the next several years, able to tap large new reserves of oil or natural gas. And we have an opportunity here. We have an opportunity to help them with respect to energy governance of the energy sector, and make sure that the bidding for the allocations of drilling rights, for instance, is done in an orderly way. Make sure the money, help them make sure that the money is used effectively with a sufficient amount of transparency. Because if there's proper energy governance and proper use of reserves and resources, it can make a very big difference in the way these energy resources are used for the benefit of the country, and it can create a great deal more transparency and therefore a great deal more confidence about investors coming into those countries to invest. And we have experiences from countries that have done this well, and we have the experience of countries that have not done it very well. We can learn from those who have and provide the sort of technical assistance to help these countries develop their energy governance and their reserve management. That seems to me very useful in terms of thinking ahead about energy security, and more importantly, from some of these countries' perspective, how the money, how the resources are used, so you don't get the Dutch disease, you don't get the kinds of things that can distort energy allocation, energy resources, and use them in a negative as opposed to a positive way. The last point goes to the question you raised of water, which I think is, I'm glad you raised it, because it seems to me a great deal more work has to be done on the link between energy and water and food, and energy, water, and the environment, because they're all really part of the same whole. And one of the things about almost all these new energy technologies, including renewables, is that many of them are water intensive. And particularly this new natural gas extraction technology is very water intensive, because you have to jam the water in, crack the rock, and that frees up the natural gas. But other types of production that doesn't seem as if it would take a lot of energy does, particularly if you look at energy as sort of a battery. When you have windmills pumping energy up and down as part of the way you store pumping water up and down as part of the way you store the energy. So I think that one of the things when we talk about security, it may turn out that there will be almost certainly a lot of energy security issues. Water security issues are going to be another very important topic on the international agenda. And a group such as this group and others at Davos that tend to look across sectors and try to look into the future and not be trapped by the past ought to focus on this, because it's going to be an issue of growing importance from both an environmental and a national security perspective.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. I think thank you especially that you also touched the issue of sharing with your experience internationally with energy security governance. That's one of the main and important points here that we have to debate. Our next panelist is Anand Sharma, and I think what we have seen recently in the way I saw Copenhagen, Mr. Sharma, is that I was a success, failure, or the beginning of something? I don't want to debate that here, but one thing I saw there was quite an activity and energy from emerging markets. So that was very, very good sign. You are not only the fastest growing markets or industries or countries, China and India and others, but you are also taking care of climate and environment. So please, your main comments.
Thank you, Armen. See, this issue of energy security, in my view, has to be taken in the national context and global context. And truly, the needs differ from country to country, as well as from continent to continent. There's a huge gap between the developing and the developed countries. And as the economies will grow in the coming years and decades, particularly what you refer to as the emerging economies, the energy requirement, energy consumption is bound to increase. Therefore, how to access clean sources of energy, clean development mechanisms, and sharing of technologies, investing in innovation and development of technologies. There has to be a larger global partnership to address this. Also, the issue of energy security, as you said, And Birol said about linking to climate change. Climate change is one of the issues. This is not something which has happened overnight, and we have woken up to it. We know when Kyoto Protocol took place. It has been causing concern, and no hesitation to say that it is a shared global concern. But the responses have to be correct, appropriate, and timely. Because this situation has been brought about by unsustainable methods of production and consumption over a long period of time. And the emerging economies like India, even today, our share, global share of energy is very little compared to the fact that we are home to close to 20% of the world's population. And also, the energy security, in our view, is linked, besides climate change, to food security, power security, and development. We cannot address one or two and leave the other aside. We live in a world, the 21st century, after the first decade, that 1 billion people are denied food security, and 1.5 trillion people do not have energy security. And of that 1.5 trillion, 500 million live in India who do not have access to commercial energy. Therefore, universal access to energy to sustain the developmental aspirations have to be addressed. There's minimal energy which citizens in any country would need, even if they do not have the capacity to pay. That's what we call energy security, or a lifeline. In addition to that, what would be the safe energy and reliable source of energy? Here in my country, half of the population, they depend on kerosene. The supply is also not regular. And what about the large number of women who have to cook and collect firewood? So these are complex issues, and accordingly, global responses have to be well coordinated, coherent, and pragmatic. Before I rest my case, I would only like to say that for a long time to come, the dependence on fossil fuels is going to remain. As Robert was saying, that new sources of energy and cleaner sources of energy, including the gases, have to be accessed, including the renewable sources of energy, whether it's the geothermals, the solar, the wind, in which we too are investing in a big way, and also the nuclear energy. That alone can reduce the dependence on fossil fuels, because there are only 30 countries which have adequate hydrocarbon reserves, oil and gas. 170 countries of the world are net importers of oil and gas. But while looking for these renewables and to reduce the dependence on fossil fuels, one thing has to be borne in mind, which has been, for me, a matter of grave concern in recent years, that of biofuels, particularly the diversion of food for fuel, grain for fuel. It's a very dangerous approach. While we have to ensure energy security, we cannot subvert the need of food security in the global context. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. I think you touched. Thank you for your presentation, because you emphasized on the example of India, which is a sort of a smaller planet, the complexity of the issues and how vital they are for individuals. And also thank you for the point that you made about this very, very sensitive link between energy and food, and where we are. If we don't harmonize, can we just basically sacrifice one for the other, or vice versa? Lars, you represent business, and I think it will be interesting to hear your point here, and what is that you will be expecting, being a part of Europe, also from the governments. Mm-hmm. What sort of support you will need from the governments to do your job better and cleaner? Thank you.
I'll come to that, of course. First, I'd like to underline what we just heard, that we can never forget that and 1.5 billion people do not have access to energy. And of course that is no energy security at all. And to unlock that is also, it's food related, but it's growth related, it's job related. That has to be done. And of course energy security is a question of affordability, but also acceptability. What forms of energies do we, as citizens, as society, accept? It's also, of course, a question of accessibility. The challenge of growth, energy security, and climate change was touched upon. And I think in many cases, as Fatih said, they would go hand in hand and work together. And looking at the climate change issue, the requirement, to me it's nothing less than that we have to rebuild the entire world economy, the infrastructure of the world, because it's not sustainable. Of course, this is a monumental task. The good thing about it is that that is a job creator and a source of growth as well. The direction, and Fatih was also hinting on that the transport system of the world has to be made sustainable. And in that, representing, of course, the part of the energy industry which is producing electricity, I could enjoy saying that the future is electric, which is, of course, good for our business. And why is that? Well, when we look at all the sectors of our economy, it's probably the easiest thing to make the electricity sector low carbon and sustainable. And that is certainly a direction that I expect the world will take for that reason. It's also energy efficient, which also means that it would support the affordability. Of course, coming then to business and what do business request or they require? Well, if we're going to rebuild the world, it's almost rhetorical then to say that it would need massive investments. And these investments will have to come, for the vast majority of them, from private capital, private funds. And I think that cannot be said enough, that these investments, these funds, will compete with other investment opportunities. And there are a few things which the people supplying capital would be looking for. And one is transparency. Another thing is longevity, that is the long-term nature. Can we trust the rules of the game going forward? It's also continuity. And if you have secured these three, then there will be made return in investment calculations, and then these returns will be measured against other returns. And if we in the world and the policymakers, decision makers of the world, can get this equation right, these investments will be forthcoming, and then we will be rebuilding the world. We will creating millions, if not billions, of new jobs, and we will sort out the energy security question, the growth question, as well as the climate change issue. So I think the good thing in that is that it is actually doable. That is, we can do it. In fact, we know what to do. The conditions, the rules of the game needs to be set to enable it. And that I think is a positive note, that we actually know how to do it. We just need to set this free. It did not happen in Copenhagen. There is still work to be done, but I think we will keep working at it. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. Since your last sentence was about Copenhagen, I think it's the right time to ask Jim.
Oh, gosh. Okay. So there's a lot to talk about here, and I won't try and cover all of it, but let me just try and highlight a few things and then talk about solutions. One is we've talked about energy security largely in terms of oil, and that makes sense in a lot of respects. And we've noted here that security, the growth of the economy, and climate change come together here as convergent interests. And I think that's a really important starting point. But it's also important to recognize that the solutions are not automatically convergent. When people look at the challenge of energy security, they tend often to default to coal, if they're talking about oil security, coal, which is in many cases more abundant, or to so-called non-conventional fuels like tar sands. And both of those are not only, well, tar sands not only expensive, but both of them, coal and tar sands, are, from a climate perspective, devastating. It's not to say we're going to stop using coal tomorrow. It's not to say that some emerging economies won't have to continue to develop some of their coal resources, but coal cannot be the solution to energy security if we're at the same time going to protect the climate. And similarly with non-conventional fuels like tar sands. Tar sands has a carbon penalty in terms of production of about 3 times conventional oil production, also hugely expensive and environmentally damaging in many other ways. So the default, the sort of natural tendency of the system to go to coal or to go on to other kinds of oil, non-conventional production, is seriously dangerous for the climate. Now, the good news is there are, as I think a couple of speakers have already suggested, convergent solutions here. I mean, it is, in fact, possible to meet the challenge of energy security and get to 2 degrees. And I agree that gas can be a transition fuel in that strategy. But it means that we really push hard now, and I mean now, on efficiency, on the efficiency gains that are there to be had at a profit, and on moving strongly towards renewables as the basis of the energy economy. I'm thinking less biofuels than solar and wind, but clearly renewables need to be at the very heart of the new energy economy. Now that meets one of the criteria that Robert set. Renewable sources can be, in fact, very diverse in terms of suppliers. Diverse beyond all imagining. Every house can be a supplier in a renewable energy system. But from a climate perspective, they have to lie at the very heart of this. Because if the scientists tell us that if we're going to stay below 2 degrees, total emissions, total global emissions have to peak in the next decade and begin to decline. And that's a very hard thing to get to, right? I mean, that means moving very fast. Now, let me then say just a couple things about what has to happen for that to occur. Most important on the policy front, as Lars already suggested, is price. We have to stop subsidizing the bad stuff. Right? We have to stop subsidizing oil production and coal production and so forth. And we have to start figuring out how we encourage the economy to move into the things that will be part of the future. And so that means eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, and it means finding a way to put a price on carbon that drives the whole market in the right direction. It means moving ahead on efficiency, as I've said. It means really cracking the problem of transportation. And I agree here again with Lars. Transportation needs to go electric in a big way, because we can produce electric power with renewable sources. And as I said, it means going strongly with renewables. Now let me take that back then to Copenhagen. Okay. Many of the things I've talked about can happen at a national level and need to happen at a national level. There's no need to wait for a global deal for countries to move aggressively in this sphere. And that's industrialized countries who need to bring their emissions down on the order of 80% by 2050, a lot. But it's also emerging economies. Who need to find a way to get onto a low-carbon development path to meet the energy needs and economic and development aspirations of their people, but in a way that's much lower carbon than the current model. And I agree that's going to take a global partnership, both in terms of technology and in terms of finance. So all of those things are things that can move, but ultimately we need a global deal. And the good news about Copenhagen was that in the run-up to Copenhagen, you saw finally all the major emitting countries putting targets on the table. And in the closing days of Copenhagen, you saw heads of states working together to try and figure out a way to move forward. That's the good news. Bad news is they didn't come close to moving forward as boldly as we need to move if we're going to stay below 2 degrees. And that's the challenge that lies ahead in the months to come.
Well, thank you very much. Just to continue where you stopped, I would like to go back to Robert and ask him, first of all, his reaction on coal and United States. Secondly, United States is a leader today in high-tech technology, and the government and the president have announced a very impressive, basically, approach to encourage renewables. And the good news is that you see a lot of activity in the United States on gas. And I personally, I'm very much involved also in a lot of venture capital funds and firms that are involved in California elsewhere on renewables. The question stands here is the money, Robert, on its way? Has it come, or it's going to come? Because giving a vision, showing the way, encouraging people, and I think the government eventually have to come also with the money as well.
Well, the answer is that it is coming. There was $80 billion in the Recovery Act. A lot of it is for renewables. This is not only underway, but large portions have already been spent. Not all of it. You can't spend $80 billion overnight, but it is being spent at a fairly rapid pace, and it is helping to develop a lot of new technologies. First of all, some of it's for substantial amounts for research, but also the fact that that money is out there is inducement to research and development, because people know that if they come up with new products, then there's going to be this government-supported market for them. So the answer is, this is an enormous commitment of President Obama. It's an enormous commitment of the United States. We haven't seen anything like this in the past of this order of magnitude, and it will be a substantial amount. I would say also to other countries, China is putting a lot of money into similar kinds of technologies, and the more countries that do this, the better. It's not a zero-sum game here. If other countries invest in new technologies and come up with new breakthroughs, that's useful for the United States. If we do it, and you bring the price points down and the quality of the technology up, that's very useful. Electric transportation is a critical element of this. I totally agree. That is where there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there, which can be derived. And let me make one more point, that the question of subsidies, which was raised, and Lars talked about it, and I think that is an extremely important element of the solution. The United States and other countries in the group of 20 came up with, in Pittsburgh, a commitment to reduce and ultimately eliminate subsidies for hydrocarbons. This, to me, is extremely useful. First of all, these subsidies are a distortion of the use of money. Second, they give hydrocarbons an edge over other technologies because they're subsidized, and many of these others are not subsidized, or at least not substantially subsidized. And third, it puts governments on the right side of that issue. So to the extent you come from countries that are not sufficiently bold in reducing their energy subsidies for hydrocarbons, it is a very valid thing for civil society to weigh in very heavily with their leaders and urge them to do it. It's good for the environment, it saves you taxpayers money, and it also induces more non-conventional fuel production, because it's not as much at a disadvantage in terms of government support.
Okay, thank you,
That's
Robert.
a little plug for civil activity.
Thank you, Robert. I come back to Anand, and the question is about, we heard those words about global deal, global partnership on climate. Do you think that we need also a global partnership or framework or a closer cooperation on energy security, and food, energy, water as well? Do we need more cooperation or institutional, or maybe we need another is the G20 the right platform? Or maybe we should create something like E20, the Energy 20.
Let's not have too many 20s.
It's not a question of multiplicity of multilateral platforms, but what is effective and what is functional. We are living in a different world, and the century that we have left behind, and even the first decade of the 21st century. Both the political and economic power shifts are taking place. When you look at the expansion of economies and also industrial production, particularly in the emerging major economies. It is clearly acknowledged, therefore, that G8 or the exclusivist platforms could not find solutions or address the contemporary challenges, and that's why G20 has emerged as a credible platform in which which has a representative character. But when I was referring to partnership, it's very clear that the partnership has to take a macro view, look at the real picture globally, even by all what we have heard today, maybe trillions of dollars being invested between now and 2030 in new technologies for accessing cleaner sources of energy. Still, these are frightening numbers that 1.3 billion people may still be denied access to commercial energy or energy security. So without a partnership, this cannot be addressed, and partnership has to be all-encompassing, both for the development of technologies, sharing of technologies, pooling of resources, and sharing of resources, because there are many countries who cannot be held responsible for what has happened, but at the same time they're too poor and vulnerable. They do not have the resources. Mitigation, adaptation is beyond them. And the larger issue of when businesses also invest and the governments invest in the new technologies, how they should be transferred or shared. I feel that the intellect of the world should be used for the larger good of the humankind. If conscious of the challenges which we are discussing of energy security and climate change, if only the mercantile interests determine decisions, the humankind would be left gasping. So this issue, I'm afraid, was not addressed adequately at Copenhagen. It has not been adequately addressed now. There are other areas where you can say that there are countries which can afford, and the debate that whether some of the emerging economies can, yes. China, India, Brazil, maybe some other countries will be also in a position to develop technologies. But the issue would remain. As I said right in the beginning, unless and until developmental challenges are addressed, and also poverty. Poverty remains the biggest polluter, and it will.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Anand. And I think what you expressed here is very important. The importance of the partnership, dialogue, maybe institutions. For the moment, we have a World Economic Forum, the Davos here, and we have this dialogue. Maybe we can build up something out of our dialogues and on the basis of World Economic Forum. Before opening basically our panel for your questions, I would like to go back again to Fatih, and with a question. You addressed a very important part, which was oil. And oil and gas, the future of oil and gas, will depend also not only on the future findings and exploration, but how much money will be invested in those. With the vision that you have, that we should dramatically address the issue of using less oil, okay, and the pressure of the climate change, where the private companies are going to find the investment. Because in many cases, because some cases the oil and the gas are close to the surface in geographically nice areas, but in many cases they are in very, very difficult ones, need huge investments. How do you address that, Fatih?
You are right, Armen. It's a big challenge. But let me first, with one word, tell you and the colleagues here why I focus on oil rather than coal and gas. Coal, I don't need to talk about it. There is no energy security problem per se. But in terms of gas, in fact, in the next 4 or 5 years, we are going to see a gas glut rather than the scarcity in terms of gas, mainly as a result of the silent revolution taking place in the United States. And it will have major implication for everybody, also for the gas exporters. But if there's a geopolitical incident, I don't know in terms of gas security, but under normal market conditions, we shouldn't have major problems. And in terms of oil, now, resources are there, but I think the private companies, especially the many IOCs, have major difficulties to access those resources. And as such, I think some of them need to look for new business strategies to redefine their businesses because the oil they have under their hands and ownership is declining and declining rapidly. So they have to find new business areas. It can be LNG, it can be renewables, and the others. Two more things. One, I think a major reduction in the CO2 emissions compared to a business as usual case will come from China. But this will not be driven by climate change concerns. They will be driven by energy security concerns. China will push the button for many alternative technologies, more efficiency, as I mentioned, more electrical vehicles and more renewables and so on, not mainly to reduce the CO2 emissions, but improve the energy security and lessen their vulnerability vis-a-vis the high energy prices. I can tell you that $147 last year traumatized many countries in the developing world, and they wouldn't like to see such a development. One last word about Copenhagen. Armen, you mentioned should be optimistic or pessimistic about what happened in Copenhagen. I mean, at least I can tell you, I would personally say that I need to be in a very optimistic mood to say that I am indecisive about the outcome of Copenhagen. I think as energy sector, we did not get the right signal in order to make a transformation there. And if it continues, which seems very likely in the current political context, we may definitely lose a decade, as there will be many low investments which will be done in the meantime without taking into consideration the climate change, and those power plants, inefficient, for example, coal-fired power plants, will be with us 50, 60 years and will lock in the emissions for many years to come. So we are facing a major risk of losing 10 very crucial years.
Well, it's nice to hear from you, your evaluation about, let's say, one of the biggest emerging countries like China, because I saw recently their plans for the next 20, 25, 30 years on building or using wind energy. It's quite an impressive, if they will do what they say, and usually they do what they say. Basically, probably in 2 decades, we will end up China producing from wind energy, which will be equal to the whole energy volume of United Kingdom, which is huge. And if I may allow Jim and Lars, because we don't have much time, we go to our floor, because I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions, and then you'll have the opportunity to answer them. Please. Could you please say who you are and make the question sharp and to the point?
My name is... No,
okay, you have the microphone. Go ahead, you have the microphone. We need the microphone.
Sorry, I got it at least. So, Sten Rigsgaard is my name. I'm from Novozymes in Denmark. And now I go to these kind of sessions very often, and then I hear biofuel being more and more in the background, whereas electric cars are coming to the forefront. And so, but still, according to the McKinsey abatement curve, then the cost of abatement for electric cars is not even on the chart, because the price is much higher than €60 per ton abated. Whereas you'll find first and second generation on the chart. So
what's the question?
So I'd like to address, I have the panel address this apparent situation. Why is it that everybody is talking about electric cars? It's very expensive, whereas the second generation bioethanol is ready for deployment now at a very reasonable cost.
Okay, whom do you want the answer to the question? Lars?
Yeah, maybe Lars would be a good point, okay. And maybe also Jim, please.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please. Lars?
Okay, thank you. I think from an economic and climate change point of view, and energy efficiency point of view, I believe that biofuel will not be the winner then. I'll just offer one thought, and that is instead of biofuel, maybe use biomass to produce electricity in that concept, in order to fuel the transport sector. And this is for these reasons that we see these clear trends at the moment.
So Steen, just to quickly add to that, I don't mean to dismiss biofuels altogether. There have been, of course, a lot of concerns in the first generation about conflicts with food and, of course, with water and other concerns. There are possibilities out there that could alleviate those concerns, and so there may be a role. From our perspective, the appeal of electrification is that you can see electrification on a very large scale in a way that can be completely green in terms of carbon because of the prospect of shifting the power sector entirely to renewables. I mean, our sites are on a zero carbon power sector in Europe by 2050. That seems an entirely doable proposition, and then electric cars become quite an appealing part of that picture.
Oh, well, thank you. Please.
I'm Barbara Judge. I'm chairman of the UK Atomic Energy Authority. So I wonder, when we're talking about energy security, energy independence, climate change, why nobody has mentioned nuclear as part of the mix. We're spending so much money proving the technology of renewables, which are very worthy, but doesn't nuclear have some part to play in the energy security discussion when it doesn't emit carbon?
Yes, I can. Well, it's a very important point that you have raised. I did in passing refer to the nuclear energy, besides other non-renewable sources of energy. In my country, in India, we have an ambitious program to expand nuclear energy generation. We have an installed capacity of 5,000 megawatts. We are now installing new reactors. By 2020, it should be more than 20 gigawatts of nuclear energy in India, and we want to take it to at least 65 gigawatts by 2030, if not earlier, and to 250 by 2050. So it is already rolled out. Besides, we also have an installed capacity already of non-conventional, of wind and solar, of 15,000 megawatts, and we have just commissioned a solar mission, which will kick in by 2020, again, 20,000 megawatts or 20 gigawatts. So we are focusing in a big way on nuclear energy because, in my understanding, I'm not an expert, it is the cleanest and the most renewable sources of energy.
Well, Robert, would you like to add something?
Yes, generally, we have not ruled out in the United States more attention to nuclear either. I mean, this is, it was, you know, I don't have to tell you, Barbara, we haven't built a nuclear plant in some time, but there have been expansions of existing plants. That tends not to get fully understood. And I think over a period of time, this is going to receive new attention, in part because of the desire to meet the Copenhagen goals, and in part because it does have a number of attributes. There are obviously the issues that you're aware of, the waste and things of that sort, but this has not been ruled out in the United States at all as a future option because of the urgency of increased domestic production of energy, and also because it does meet some of the objectives of a cleaner energy environment down the road.
Okay. Jim is smiling. I don't know, is the smile of support or not for nuclear?
So, no, we don't think expansion of nuclear power is part of the solution. The reason for that is twofold. One is it's a huge diversion of capital. It's hugely expensive, and almost every nuclear plant ends up running way over the initial projections. And it's already hugely, and that's even despite big subsidies, not least liability. But the second, and for me actually more important, is to support nuclear power, you have to believe two things. You have to believe that we can control the risks from accidents, from waste and proliferation, and that we will successfully control those risks. And I think that's a doubtful proposition.
May I disagree with this?
Yeah,
just one
but
second.
there's someone who... I'm sorry, we
just to Jim, you agree with the electrification of the mobility with the cars, no? I think it is, one should check very carefully. If you, on one hand you electrify the cars, and on the supply side, PG side, power generation side, you have only renewables. Is it compatible or not? Yes. I think it's not compatible. Well,
okay.
you cannot get 100% electricity generation from renewables, and in addition to delivering electricity to the household, industry, and so on, you are going to feed the transportation system. One has to think twice about that.
No. Okay, can I just quickly? We have, of course, thought twice about that. Okay. So for us, I mean, let's not forget efficiency, right? There are huge gains in the power system to be had from efficiency, investing in efficiency, and then beyond that, renewables. And for us, I mean, doing the numbers, we think you can get there, and that's better than casting your lot with nuclear.
Okay, as not as a chairman, but as a former professor of physics, let me not also not agree with Jim, because. I do know that technology is very safe, and most of the disasters that we have, including the Chernobyl, were not technological disasters. They were human errors. And then the other thing is that we have, of course, it's a very, very complex. And there are 2 or 3 panels here addressing this issue. I think if we go ahead only with the nuclear, we will not be there. Of course, there are issues of nuclear fuel, the management, which in America is combined with the waste. But there is also the waste in European understanding, which is basically the dirty water with the dirt and everything. So there are issues of nuclear management, non-proliferation, the management of the fuel, management of the waste. But I do believe that, do we like it or not, the technology is there. We cannot stop it. It's better we take care of it properly and develop it.
Okay, very quickly. This is why I was smiling before, right? I hate this question.
Eventually we know why you are smiling.
But this is my point. Huh? It's the human systems that you're counting on, not breaking down. And I think our experience with that is pretty checkered, and that's the risk in the end. But
well, and on
just to quickly mention here that when it comes to the human factor and the risk, there have been enough accidents, enough casualties in other power projects, including thermal projects, hydro projects worldwide.
Fantastic. So I think this is a very, very interesting topic, and I'm inviting all of you to come and to participate. We have 3 another sessions during this days where Energy Security Council is involved on nuclear. Please, your question.
My question, not only to the panel, but everyone in this room, is what are you doing today to learn about green roofs? Because green roofs go to every problem we're talking about. Sustainable development is long-term survival of the planet. That's about the environment. It's about nature and nature's ability to heal itself. The environmental issue is land, water, air, and biodiversity. By one solution, the requirement of all governments anywhere to require all buildings to have a green roof, we actually begin to address every one of these issues. The sterilization of the world is occurring with urbanization everywhere.
Excuse me, as a chairman, I have to ask you to put down your note and just repeat the question.
The question is, what are you doing, every individual here, to learn about the benefits and the value of green roofs and having one environmental policy by all governments that all new buildings have a green roof on it?
Thank you very much for the question. What I'm going to do, I'm going to ask 2 or 3 people to address questions because we don't have much time, and the panel to answer them. Your turn, please. Question. So we have 1 question to everybody. Second question, please.
K.R. Sridhar, CEO of Bloom Energy in California. So we talked about the 1.5 billion people who are out of grid and out of luck. And then we talked about the massive capital needed to put transmission distribution infrastructure. Shouldn't we be thinking about distributed generation as a leap forward path, similar to what happened in computing, similar to what happened in telephony, for electricity? And as we're redesigning, rethinking, is that a solution that we should be strongly considering? Also looking at the security perspective, because any centralized facility by nature is subject to natural and man-made disasters.
Right. Thank you. Whom is it to address the question? To anybody or
anyone on the panel?
Thank you. Third one here, please. And we'll go to the panel, whoever wants to answer.
Arnold Goldman from Bright Source, and addressing to the panel, kind of in contrast to green roofs and distributed power, I think addressing specifically to transportation, dealing with eco-cities like even New York is using about 1/2 the amount of energy as the rest of the United States. And if you designed higher cities, they don't have so much roof. Urban sprawl is probably the biggest cause of transportation over the last 50 years of increases. Do we address that with, on one side, with eco-cities and building differently, not to distribute power, and in the non-distribution of power, and you're dealing with large solar and large renewables, as Jim has been saying, I didn't hear, and I think it's critically important, that resources like nuclear and coal actually don't become out of the equation, but be looked at as backup fuel and having switching stations so that you can put in reliably these renewable resources on large scale.
Well, thank you. So it's more a statement rather than a question.
No, it's a question.
Okay.
Both those are being investigated.
Fine. Anybody would like to answer?
Can I start with
Jim?
the distributed power question? So distributed power, yes, big time. Right? And for me, one of the exciting things about renewable energy technologies is that they allow distribution on a scale we haven't imagined before, and that gives you a lot of stability in the system and a lot of benefits. And that's true at the household level, right? I mean, you certainly have the prospect of buildings and houses that are now net energy providers. You need smart grids and even super grids to make all of that work, but still lots of potential there. It's also true at intermediate scales. And I mean, I worked with a professor in India, for example. I hesitate to use this example, so I'm going to be out of my depth in a second, but who argued strenuously for medium-scale biomass as a gasification, as a technology for electric power production. It's in some ways much more reliable than long-distance transmission of centrally produced power. And whether or not those specifics pan out, I think distributed power has a lot of possibilities.
Well, thank you. Robert?
Just one quick point. You pointed a question of the vulnerability of the grid. I do think that is an issue, at least in countries with very sophisticated smart grid systems or those countries that are planning them. Because we've seen in the Eastern Corridor, with the very networked energy that we have, when one little thing goes out in Cleveland, I think it was several years ago, the whole East Coast went dark. And I do think that we're going to have to be very careful when we do what I think is a wise thing, which is to have a smart grid and a network grid, and Europe's going to be doing more of this, to have much better safeguards to avoid these sorts of catastrophes. It's a national security issue if someone were to decide that's the preferred way of disrupting the American economy, to interrupt those grids or sabotage them. But it could also be human error. It could also be mechanical error. But I think this is going to require a lot more attention, because the first major blackout that occurs on the smart grid system, there'll be a lot of criticism as to whether this new technology creates more opportunities or more vulnerability. So it's a very good point that you raised.
Thank you. Fatih?
Okay, I think I also agree that distributed generation could be a very good option, but in addition to energy security, for economic reasons. Lars mentioned our study, 1.5 billion people who have no access to electricity. And it's mainly in India and sub-Saharan Africa. And it's a major issue, by the way. And I agree with Mr. Minister that it is a part of energy security issue. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where we have 800 million people, the amount of electricity used there is equal to the electricity used in New York City, where you have 8 million people. 8 million versus 800 million, and the same amount of electricity is used. But the bulk of this access to electricity problem is becoming a rural area issue. This is about 3/4 of 1.5 billion people are more and more in the rural city. It is not because electricity is increasing in the cities, but people are going to the cities from rural areas. So it is more and more becoming a rural issue. And in order to avoid transmission and distribution investments, which is half of the total power generation investments, I think it's a very wise issue. In terms of cities, I think city planning is very important. Just to leave you with a number, today about 75% of the CO2 emissions are coming from the cities, and only 25% comes outside the boundaries of the cities, which again tells us how important it is to have right urbanization policies.
Thank you, Lars.
I just want to make a very brief comment. I now notice we come to the point which we do in many discussions, that is the tendency that we all have to try and pick winners. I would rather say that this is maybe an unnecessary discussion, because the problem we're facing is so big that we're going to need them all. The most important thing is actually what I said initially, that we do create a framework which will make investments in a transparent world, where actually the price signals will determine what will actually win in the market that day. And that is so important, because the monumental task we have, we're going to do whatever we can to solve it. And we will not have the luxury of saying, I like that, I don't like that.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just add to this distribution on the spot and nuclear. I've seen recently very interesting designs of new generation of nuclear power plants that are good news coming from the military side. They are small, 300 megawatt ones that were based on submarine reactors, and they could be basically blocked in huge areas instead of having transmission. Now, please, your question.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Josefsson from Beijing, and my question for the English-speaking panelists. And you addressed about this energy security issue, but it seems to me are very quite different. Some people talking about enough supply or plenty of supply. Some people talk about the cheap supply, or some people talk about usage of this energy. That means no emission of the CO2. Some people talk about safe transportation. So I wonder, and you are talking about the energy security, or you are talking about the energy safety. And I cannot tell the difference in English, but it seems to me are very different. When you're worried about the explosion of battery, that's a safety. It's not a security issue. So here, the first question, related to a second question to Minister Hormats, and USA is the only global power. And so from American perspective, and in the terms of the global security or safety, which one is the more urgent? The urgency of the supply of the oil, I mean the secure supply to the countries, or the safe usage of the oil, and which one is the more urgent for the global interests? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So we have two questions. Your question, please. You wanted the question.
Julia King, Vice-Chancellor of Aston University. What I wanted to put to the panel, I think has been partly covered, but I think it's worth emphasizing, which is that how do we get governments to recognize the impact of city planning, which costs them nothing, versus all this new technology? In Hong Kong and Calgary, which have similar GDP per head, less than 20% of vehicles of journeys are taken by private car in Hong Kong. More than 90% of journeys are taken by private car in Calgary. And a big issue there is the North American development of all these little satellites, none of which have a high enough population density to support public transport.
Thank you. Third question. We don't have much time. Unfortunately, we are going to take last questions from you and then try to answer. Please.
Scott Bryson, I'm a member of Parliament from Canada. And my question is about the role of CO2 sequestration and the potential for CO2 sequestration, given that there's a consensus, I believe, that we need all forms of conventional and alternative energy, and it's going to take a broad mix. There does seem to be a role for new technologies, and particularly new clean conventional technologies.
And your question, please. Further down, please.
Andrew Doman from Russell Investments. I have a different sort of question. I'm worried about the volatility of the price of oil. And I think we understand that that's due to the sort of inelasticity of supply and also the inelasticity of demand. But this has major effects on, or implications for a potential shock to the world economy. What steps are we taking to increase the flexibility of supply or the flexibility of demand to try to mitigate or smooth out those effects?
Well, thank you very much for questions, and it goes to the panel now. We start with, and let me add the last question to the panel as well. We spoke about cooperation, need of partnership, cooperation, coordination. So how far do you think and in what sort of cooperation, coordination, partnership you would envisage in energy security? That's my last question. And we start with answering your questions and my questions, starting from Fatih. Fatih, please.
So we answer all of them? Or?
You answer whatever you like, Fatih.
Okay, perhaps I can just answer with one word, three things. With CCS, carbon capture and storage, I think it is a crucial technology and a very promising technology, but a promising one. It is not yet there, and neither financially nor technologically and nor legal forms are proven and running up at a scale which we could link our hopes 100%. So we as IEA think that it is a very important technology, but much more needs to be done in order to CCS to be viable, especially in the electricity generation sector, plus in the context of enhanced oil recovery for the oil production. A crucial technology, and we cannot afford to miss that chance. A volatility of the oil prices, I tried to mention it in the introductory remarks. I think looking at with the current policies, I think after the economy rebounds, we may well see a high and volatile price environment, which is a very bad news for the, I think, for everybody, even for the producers, because higher prices than what we see now may well be a risk for the global economy and global economic recovery, which in turn may be a bad news even for the producing countries, as they need also clients with healthy economies. And one of the ways, as I suggested, is to improve the flexibility on the demand side. And when we say on the demand side, it is the transportation sector, because more than 95% of the growth in the oil demand comes from the transportation sector. So therefore, alternative technologies there, including more efficiency, more biofuels, I said in the beginning, and our colleagues might have not heard it, but especially second-generation biofuels, but most importantly, advanced car technologies are key in order to enhance the flexibility. And finally, in terms of security, I think there is an organization which looks after the energy security issues. At least we have, this is the International Energy Agency, which I'm working for, and we have about 28 member governments. Plus, we are working with many governments, including China and India, in order to enhance that security concerns. But perhaps when we talk about the cooperation and when we talk about the climate change, one word on the Copenhagen, we have seen that the UNFCCC process, which has been very successful up to Copenhagen, we saw some limitations of the UNFCCC process. I think it may not be a better idea if there are some other type of formations which would help support the UNFCCC process in order to have a deal soon, if not very, very soon.
Well, thank you, Fatih, but I would like to urge our panel to be sharp and to the point, because I'm getting signs that we don't have much time. Please.
All right, let me try to answer just two parts of this group of questions. One, the volatility of prices. One of the problems is that demand tends to be price elastic. That is to say, if prices go up, demand tends to go down if they go up enough. Supplies tend to be price inelastic, or at least only very slowly price elastic. That's one element of the problem. The other part of the problem is that you could improve, in my judgment, or reduce to a degree volatility if more big countries in particular, had strategic petroleum reserves. As you know, under the IEA, there is a very good formula for that. Some of the large consuming countries do not yet have strategic reserves, or at least not one sufficient to the size or adequate given the size of the country's demand. And the other part is that more transparency of information would be very helpful. A lot of countries, including big demand countries, don't publicly provide information on their requirements, on their purchases in the market. The IEA has been very effective in urging this, but countries that don't do that actually lead to market uncertainties, and those market uncertainties tend to be negative in terms of volatility. The second part that I thought was very interesting, our colleague from China raised the question of what the American preference was. I think we tend to look at this in the following way. there are two issues. One, you mentioned this, the amount of supply, the availability of supply, and the other is the risk factor. They're not entirely separable. Obviously, as I mentioned at the outset, the more supplies of more alternatives, that is to say diversification of supply and transportation and of fuels, helps to produce more long-term security, but also making sure that those within that overall framework, there is a reduction in the vulnerability, that is to say avoidance of large-scale disruptions of delivery, either by conscious decisions of governments or by technological mistakes or by human error. In particular, in the last several years, we haven't had the latter two, where there have been disruptions. These have been consciously done by individual governments for relatively short periods of time, which has tended to have a disruptive effect, particularly on natural gas. So that's my take on that.
Thank you, Robert. Lars?
Very, very briefly, then, in the interest of time. On CCS, my company Vattenfall has a pilot plant running the last 1.5 years. We're very encouraged by the results, very good. We believe it will be fully commercial by 2020. There is, of course, a price penalty. The cost versus conventional coal is probably up with about 30-35%, which seems cheap in front of the challenge that we have. On your question, well, how can we sort this out? I think what happens out there in the world is a consequence, of course, of policies, of technology, and available capital. And all of these policies, at least today, are national, which means that we have outcomes differently in different countries. The world have now tried to create a global rules of the game, so far not succeeded, and which is probably due to the fact that this is geopolitics and it's actually the power game of the world, where the big countries roll. And maybe that would be an interesting experiment to try and cut the world in a different way. We have business on one hand, we have NGOs on the other hand, we have the labor movement on the third hand, and maybe I think we all agree on the goal. Mm-hmm. And maybe it would be interesting to see, if we agree on the goal, could we actually find a common practical way to get to the goal beside the political process?
Thank you, Lars. Jim?
Okay, so 4 questions. On city planning, absolutely, huge. And London has shown what can be done in existing cities. China has enormous opportunity to build new cities in a way that is low carbon, because China is building cities at a fantastic rate. CCS, it'll surprise you after my nuclear answer that we support the development of CCS as a technology, still not proven. The important thing there is that it not be a reason to take the foot off the pedal in developing renewables and driving efficiency, right? It can't let us off the hook, but it can, in fact, mitigate the coal that has to be built. Third, on volatility of oil prices, the best possible thing, of course, is to really push hard on efficiency and renewables, so you're not so dependent on oil and not so hostage to that market. On cooperation and energy security, the best thing from our perspective would be to start with a global deal on climate.
Yes, thank you very much. Anand?
Well, planning is important for any country. And in India, we are investing in clean development technologies. And in the next 2 decades, we will be investing $700 billion, if not more. Because as the economy expands, we will be moving from the present status of generation and consumption to become the 3rd largest consumer of electricity in 2 decades, after US and China. At the same time, the technologies of CCS, it is yet not proven. It will take time. And it's also the universal application. And it takes me back to what we have been discussing, that how would this partnership develop to make these new technologies available? Because every country is not investing in each of these technologies. There should be some distribution, some understanding reached. Those countries which are at an advanced stage of developing certain new technologies should be given support, and the others who are focusing their energy on different kinds of technology should be given support. There has to be a pooling. There has to be a coordination. And lastly, on the oil, the volatility of the oil prices. does impact economies, particularly the vulnerable economies. And we have seen in the last 2 years how unreal those prices were because of the futures and the speculative build-up. Again, we see that trend returning, and the world has not fully emerged from the economic crisis, which is the worst in the last 7 decades. And if we have that kind of inflation and the skyrocketing fuel prices and food prices, we are heading towards another problem in this year. Because whatever return to growth we are seeing, it should not be judged from the rising oil prices that the people, the countries have resources to spare. The growth is weak, the recovery is weak, and it is more stimulus-led and stimulus-inspired.
Well, thank you, Anand, and let me try not to wrap up just 3 points. On the definition of energy security, the Council, Energy Security Council, spent 2 days debating what is energy security. Now we have a formula, and I'll be happy to provide that to our Chinese friend. What's the definition of energy security? What we have learned today that the word that we lived 30 years ago was black because we were burning oil and coal. It's a bit grayish today. We know that we want a world which is green, and we know more or less how to get there. And I'm sure that the orange color of nuclear is one of the solutions that we have to add to gray in order to get to the green. And the final point is, I think what I learned here, that it's clear that we need more cooperation, coordination, and partnership, and to push the public, because at the end of the day, energy and energy security is the core of climate, it is the core of food and water. And maybe we should push for new international organization. At the core of that could be what Fatih is representing, International Energy Agency, but with a wider, basically, presence. And why not to another World Energy Conference where people will focus on that, because we had been focusing on climate because of Copenhagen a lot. And the last thing, I would like to thank everybody for coming and participating, and may I ask you to thank our panel for their hard work.
Thank you.